Converge. Yeah, I'm here with this talk called The Folly of Chasing Demographics, or the alternative title, You Don't Know Your Users and You Never Will. If you can't see them, pictured on screen are a wheelchair user, a Sikh, and a ghost. I'm a being who exists in the world. Perceive me. When I first met the Sri Lankan owner of my local corner shop in the UK, he asked me a question. He said, "Where are you from?" Well, here, like round this way, where we are now. And he replied, "Yes, but where originally?" And I thought, but I'm a white English person from England. And pictured on screen now is a tiny violin. Because of the size of the screen, it's actually much larger. It's probably the size of an actual violin, so that really ruins that visual metaphor. The other day I was in a coffee shop. I have loads of these stories. I'm going to go through quite a lot of them. The other day I was in a coffee shop. As I left the counter to take a seat, an older man laughed and asked, "Are you Indian?" I said, "No, I'm just white. I'm English. I'm from here." To which he said, "Well, you look Indian." I know what you're thinking. To which I said, "Thanks, so do you." It's just two weird fuckers having a weird conversation in a coffee shop. And he replied, "Well, I am Indian." Which made his remarks all the more flattering, but also all the more confusing. But white English people in England don't think I'm Indian. No. Many think I'm Chinese. Again, this is based primarily on two factors, and I'll cover these each in turn. One, my hair is straight. You can't tell because I've shaved it off, but it is. I have quite sort of wiry kind of hair, which may look a little Chinese, I suppose. And two, my wife is Chinese. How scientific. So where do people imagine my wife is from? Well, 50% of the time, Japan. And the reason for that is that they just try and guess. And now pictured on the screen, I've tried to kind of capture that kind of mindset, that kind of thinking in this infographic. There's key expressions like lack of self-awareness, lack of social skills, Japan, China, guesswork, and ignorance, and converging lines and spheres. Okay, so what about when I'm in China then? Okay, because I travel to China to see my Chinese family. Am I the token white guy, to use a kind of crude expression there? No, as one of the very few people not clean-shaven, I appreciate that's confusing because I am at the moment, but I usually wear a beard. I must be a Uyghur Muslim. Allahu Akbar, everyone here who belongs to that faith. Some people are so confident in their demographic designations, they won't change them, even when the subject of those designations, in this case me, corrects their assumption, which is fucking wild. So here's another one. This is a true story again. One time I was at a bar in a central London pub. The woman serving me had a wonderful Central or South American accent. I don't know which, because as I keep explaining, I'm just an ignorant English person. Anyway, she asked me where I'm from. And I give the usual sort of answer, which you're now familiar with. "Oh, just around here, well, you know, somewhere, you know, London, but not quite, Norwich." She is not happy with my answer. She just shakes her head and says, "No." Like that actually happened. Wow. I'm not sure what to do at this point. There's an awkward silence. I say, "Okay, where do you think I'm from?" Like, if you're not going to take my word for it, which is weird. And without a momentary pause, she replies, Afghanistan. True story. And that goes against Amy's dad's theory, I don't know if Amy's here yet, that I'm almost certainly Mexican. What can we learn from all this? And how do we apply it to our design systems practice? One, as Jerry actually pointed out yesterday, I shouldn't be a web developer or a technical writer or any of the sort of things that I do for work. I should be an international spy. And two, people should probably stop guessing other people's identities and, by extension, their interests and needs. Seems like a good idea. Just because someone has an axe and a beard doesn't make them a Muslim lumberjack. They might just be an axe murderer who is sensitive about a slightly weak chin. This talk is about how both these people could very well use your web interface and how it's not your job to tell them apart. Let's start with this one. Screen reader users. That doesn't mean blind users. And in fact, the term blind is just a shorthand. It means all sorts of different things to different people. What alt text would you use to describe this image? Perhaps something like, colleagues gather in an office environment. 3 men look on attentively as their female leader points to something of interest on a computer monitor. A 4th man with a neo-Nazi haircut has become mesmerized by his own striped necktie. Now, first of all, that probably needs a bit of editing down just to the salient points. It's a good example of why AI can't do your accessibility for you. It can't write alt text for you because it doesn't know your intent. It doesn't know what you're trying to convey. Anyway, one time I made the mistake of using the following alt text instead, just the empty alt text. And if you're not familiar, this is the only reliable way across browsers to stop the graphics, to stop the image tag being announced or recognized at all in screen reader software. My reason for the empty alt was this. People who can't see this don't need to know about it because it's just generic corporate stock. It doesn't tell them anything useful about the product, which is true. But as I later realized, some screen reader users see something a bit like this, a blurred image. And others something a bit like this, an image with blind spots. It turns out, interested in generic corporate stock photography is more of a bell curve. People who can see it are immediately not interested in it. It's instantaneous. People who cannot see it are probably not going to miss it, although that would be a judgment call on your part. However, some partially sighted users will sort of see it, but don't know it's just generic stock. They need clarification. They know there's an image there and they don't know what it's about, so that's frustrating. Context is also a factor. On a website where you might buy or steal stock photography, interest is higher for everyone. Of course, over time, another variable, this interest diminishes because it's still fucking corporate stock photography after all. What is the lesson here? I'm supposed to give lessons or something. Partially sighted people exist. I mean, if you don't know that already or you can't, that doesn't come to mind, then yeah, you should get your head around that. But that's not really the lesson. Not only blind people, but partially sighted people use screen readers. That's true, but we're still not quite there. Whoops. So not quite. It's designed for the tools, not what you think you know about the users, because the tools, in this case, screen readers, are shared and lives are not. Quick sidebar. The term user. Some people do not like the term user because they think it makes their audience sound like drug addicts. My advice is this: care less about certain connotations of the term user and focus on not making toxic or addictive digital products. The term user is appropriate because it's only through the use of your interface that you should come to know the person using it. You don't need to know them outside of that, and seeking to know them outside of that, and that intimately, is super creepy and probably illegal if you're not above the law, like Facebook or Google or someone like that. One of the main reasons, besides privacy, that we shouldn't detect screen reader operation, oops, sorry, I've skipped one there, is that it enables us to put our limited experience and worst assumptions into action, tailoring those users a unique and uniquely awful interface. I should have explained, by the way, I'm reading this like a storybook because I was giving this talk online and it helps with the accessibility. Clearly, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Designing for the web is and should be designing in and for the unknown. And that applies to accessibility as much as it does to responsive design. You've all read The Tao of Web Design by John Alsop, right? Blind users are not like other blind users. They are not a homogeneous, uniform group of people. Who fucking knew? A few years ago, a blind screen reader user wrote something on a famous blog, which I won't name, wherein they shared their distaste for unordered lists, so your UL and LI elements. They found them verbose and distracting and preferred when people didn't include them in the HTML. This precipitated a battle between well-meaning front-end developers, now armed with one data point, versus experienced accessibility professionals. It was exhausting. Where's all the list markup gone? You're failing WCAG 1.3.1 all over the place. Well, blind people don't like it, so we got rid of it. Wait, which blind people? Didn't you read the article? The article? So you can see how that went. Taste is another thing that we get distracted by while we're trying to make things accessible. When a visitor to your website doesn't like it, we tend to feel hurt, but we think, well, you can't please everyone. But when a disabled visitor finds it repellent, we tend to jump to the conclusion that it's inaccessible and we've let them down. If both visitors hate your website equally, it's not an accessibility issue. You have succeeded. Whenever I release a video about accessibility, someone has to catch me out by pointing out accessibility issues with the video that I've made itself. Like, oh, you claim to be an accessibility expert. I don't really. But you've not made this 100% accessible, which is impossible. The videos come with captions and transcripts, and they live on accessible web pages. So these detractors have to get quite creative in this sort of attempt to undermine what I've done. Someone even said my videos aren't accessible because they include moving images. Be honest and say you just don't like them. You would not be alone. Misleading or plain bad experiences are not necessarily inaccessible ones. This link's label, a nice video of a horse, is misleading because the link is really to a video of Rick Astley singing his famous hit. But it's not inaccessible because it is not discriminating in how it misleads. It's an equitably bad experience. There is a parity of bad experience between them, between, for example, a screen reader user and a screen reader non-user or non-screen reader user, whichever way around that's supposed to go. Everyone is rickrolled equitably. What is the lesson here? Accessibility is about achieving parity and not popularity. Don't confuse the two things. There's no accounting for taste, but fortunately you don't have to account for it. Be especially careful during testing. I once met a partially sighted user with an interesting graphic design. They wanted us to describe what the logo for the company name looked like. Thick, bulbous cursive in white, leaning gently to the right, spelling out the word bulb. But the logo is used as the homepage link, and it's well established that in this circumstance, it should describe where the link is going, what the link is doing. Bulb homepage was my recommendation, despite the feedback. Short, direct, the information they actually need as a user and customer in that role. The case I had to make for this change was disabled people aren't just disabled, and not all their interests are disability related. Who knew? So you tested with a disabled user. Great, you met a new person, but you only met that person. Your job is not just to give them whatever they ask for. They don't speak for everyone. The more testing you do and the more users you meet, the more you'll realize how unrepresentative your early encounters were of the non-existent, uniform disability demographic that existed exclusively in your head. Ultimately, you'll learn the only thing any of your users really have in common are brains, sphincters, and access to an array of tools and technologies. And the brain and sphincter parts are really kind of a given. Another quick sidebar, that thing where you try to use a computer while wearing a blindfold, or lay on your own arm until it's numb, then try to operate a mouse, You're not going to learn anything about disability that way either. If you can't already comprehend that having impaired vision or motor control is going to make life more challenging, then 20 minutes of disability cosplay isn't going to precipitate any kind of epiphany. Thank you. I actually wrote this article a while ago on Medium. It was called What Breaking My Wanking Claw Taught Me About Accessibility. The text is quite small, so I'll just read it out for you. Absolutely fuck all. You see, all along, I could use my vaulting imagination and eye-watering intellectual prowess to appreciate that doing things with one hand is more difficult than with both. It's like literally one less of two things evolved to help me do stuff together as a pair. Screen readers are not all power users. They're not all experts in using their screen readers. They're not all necessarily people who understand HTML or front-end technologies or web interfaces in general. At the BBC, we ABCD tested 4 differently coded tab interfaces. The one with the correct, as in the prescribed, ARIA attribution performed the worst. Why? Because participants were not familiar with ARIA tab interface semantics or behavior. They're relatively new and a very complex thing to be interacting with, especially non-visually. One participant thought they'd found some tags because they misheard the tab role as tag with a G. Multiple screen reader users did not know they had to use their arrow keys to switch tabs, and they simply got stuck and just lost faith. They couldn't get past or into the tab interface at all. Well, some time ago, Paul Grenier from De Key kindly gave me this testimonial for my book, Inclusive Components, which Michelle just mentioned. No other reference example has been more perfectly plagiarized by as many UI developers as any single component from Inclusive Components, which is very kind. And I think it could be true that my ARIA tab interface implementation, for example, has been copied more than any other of its kind. Well, my advice is, and has been for some time, don't copy it if you can avoid it. And certainly don't put it in your design system. That is the single reference to design systems in this talk. Because then the whole organization will start using it. Not because it is a bad implementation, it's fine. I might do it a bit differently today, I don't know, but it's all right. But because it is a tab interface, it is ontologically bollocks. Much as I'd love to say otherwise, live regions can also kind of suck. If you don't know what a live region is, I'll just quickly explain that. It's an element that announces its contents when they change. So you start off with an element with no text node, and you have this ARIA live polite attribution. There's other kinds of ARIA live attribution you can use. In this case, there's also an ARIA label, so you know that the announcement is of the kind status. And when you populate it with some text or with some text and some HTML, it will automatically just be announced in a screen reader, okay? Which is kind of cool in a lot of circumstances, or it has promised to be. Neat. But before ARIA live regions became supported, the only way to spontaneously announce some text was to move focus to that text programmatically using tab index -1, not tab index 0, because non-interactive elements should never be focusable. So anytime a live region is announced, users not familiar with them, and why should they be, would think their focus had just been stolen and moved. Naturally, this can cause some confusion and anxiety. So there are, in fact, 2 ways that ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, if you're not familiar, it's a suite of supplementary attributes to adorn your HTML with. There are 2 ways that it can make a web page less accessible, and I will list them now. 1, using ARIA incorrectly, and 2, using ARIA correctly. What is the lesson here? It's getting a bit sort of pessimistic. Train disabled users in ARIA. That seems time-intensive and cruel to me, so it's not that. Stop using tab interfaces and live regions. Well, kind of, like for the most part. Really, it's this. Do less in general, okay? That's like the one lesson that I have today, if there's any kind of lessons in this. Just do less. Because most of what you do won't work. Down your tools, like just make a simple interface as simple as possible, then down tools, and do something else. Distract yourself. Go rollerblading. Drop some acid. Prepare a small salad. Have a wank. Nothing is accessible to everyone. Therefore, anything you add to your interface can only make it less accessible overall. Simplicity, or if you prefer, tercity, is the only panacea. For starters, you don't need to try and fail to write the perfect alt text for this pointless image if you don't include the image in the first place. Remember that not everything needs to be accessible. Some things shouldn't exist at all. Everything that exists should be as accessible as possible, right? But if it's something unethical or superfluous or hateful, then don't provide it to anyone, least of all disabled users. The tab thing that I was talking about earlier almost certainly should not exist when the plain content or using just plain content is evidently more robust, responsive, easier to operate, and less complex overall. And these fucking question mark things that we put everywhere, why are we doing that? When not hiding things from users is astonishingly a better UX, not to mention an accessibility non-issue. Just put the text in the page. Thank you. Importantly, you don't need to know your own users to know these things. This is the radical part, like questioning, what are we really doing with our user research? So you can stop creeping on them. So final one, screen reader users are not necessarily disabled users. Screen reader users are screen reader users. The only thing you know about them is that they're operating a screen reader. You don't know how, you don't know with what level of competence or knowledge, you don't know where, you don't know for what reason. You may have heard this before. Accessibility isn't just for disabled people, it's for everyone. No, accessibility is for disabled people. To say otherwise is a form of erasure. But that's not to say that the tools we commonly associate with disability, like screen readers, are not simply useful pieces of software. And they're not just used by people for certain types of disability as well. We always think blindness, but there's also dyslexia, for example. Screen readers are a source of text-to-speech, which has too many uses to mention. And screen readers are just one tool of many available to anyone who wants to use them. On the web, literally anyone could encounter your interface, and with a variety of different means. So designing it for a subset of people is inherently problematic. Oh, we don't have any disabled users. Yeah, well, you never will with that attitude. But the thing about human diversity is it's really fucking diverse. So much so that your audience is fundamentally unknowable when it comes to the web. Meaning your research into that audience is really just an exercise in manufacturing preconception. It may sound cold and impersonal, because this is kind of what I'm saying here. The resolution is interfaces are just inputs and outputs. And you would do well to remember them that way. That served me pretty well. Your job is to create simple logical interfaces, supporting the available inputs and outputs, provided by the existing tools and technologies, to achieve equivalent modality, which is just a sort of posh way of saying the different kinds of inputs and outputs should make a comparable experience possible. That's pretty much everything I have to say. Just to have a soundbite, succeed at non-exclusion when you would fail at inclusion. Thank you very much. Cheers.